weekend, I decided to sleep in both days. But what about you? Did you get out to the track? And
Yeah, I rode Elsinore Saturday, dude, and I always say that track is like a box of chocolates because like you go there in the morning and it's like either extremely muddy from all the prep and watering that they did,
uh-huh.
and then by like 11 o'clock it's bone dry, dude. It's like complete polar opposite. So I always call it a
It
box of chocolates because you never know what you're gonna get.
is. I like it. Dude, that's so true. There's days I've ridden there where, I guess mostly cloudy days, so where the sun's not out and it's kept that moisture in the track all day. And on those days, I'm like, why don't I come here more often?
Yeah.
And I guess it's those days are rare because you're
Yeah.
right. Normally it's either really muddy and slippery or gets very, very dry quickly. And then it seems like you're really fighting for traction.
Dude, it really is. Traction is at a premium there. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's little of it, and then when it's there, it's like to what you said. On cloudy days, I talk to myself and I'm like, why don't I ride here more often? And then I go on a sunny day, and then I'm like, I know why.
Yeah, because I love the layout. Like the flow of the track is fun. Whether it's the intermediate or the main track, they got fun jumps and all the obstacles. The dirt is what really seems to be holding them back. And obviously they can't do much about that. That's just their location.
Yeah, for sure. So on a day like that, what would you recommend as far as like a setup wise? Because obviously the track changes a lot from early in the morning. I think they open at like 8 o'clock now, or maybe even 8:30.
Okay.
But you know, sometimes I stay until noon, even 1 p.m. some days. So what would you recommend like throughout the day? Because there's some parts of the day where I'm really happy and I just don't change anything. And there's other parts of the day where I'm like, you know what, I could adapt the bike to better suit the conditions that I'm riding in.
Gotcha. So you mean like in terms of suspension and stuff?
Correct.
For sure. Yeah, Elsinore is a tough one. And I'll tell you why. Because when it comes to adjusting suspension, the main thing we really want to do is maintain a certain feel. So meaning, say you got your bike set up for you specifically, like your revalve done, or you're really happy with the stock settings. When you go track to track or day to day, maybe to the same track, the whole point of clickers on the outside is so that way we can manipulate it to maintain a certain feel that we like out of the bike. That'll obviously change from track to track because different tracks have different obstacles. And then even the same track can just be different from day to day because of climate, how they prep it or don't prep it, and the amount of water that goes into it. To kind of expand on that then, for Elsinore is a good example because it starts off a little muddy in the morning, but there is a nice window of it being tacky. So you actually have good grip. You can corner the bike. You can ride the bike aggressively for it. But then it gets dry pretty quickly. And that's where you're really hunting for traction, it seems like.
Yep.
From my experience as a rider of riding there and then just talking to other riders as well. It gets a lot of those quick stutter bumps that you'll see going in and out of corners. And how well the bike or the wheel sticks to the ground over those bumps can be the huge difference between of how well you feel like you have traction and how much you don't have traction for it. So with that in mind, the reason I say Elsinore is a good example is because when it gets dry and hard packed like that, you want the suspension to be pretty loose. So meaning compress easy on compression and then reactive or quick on rebound so it can get back out to the ground. So now the wheels to go over those bumps quickly and get back to the ground. That gives that sensation of traction. I mean, you can feel like the tires are sticking to the ground. So from your base setup, you'd go a little bit softer on compression and then maybe even adjust rebound maybe a click or two faster as well.
Which makes sense when you think about it logically, because the faster the rebound is, the more that wheel is following the ground.
Yes.
Giving you the sensation of like a more of a traction feeling, or I like to call it as like when you ride like a Stark Varg or electric bike, it almost feels like Velcro to the ground, where it's like glued to the ground almost. Gives you that sensation more often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with rebound, there's definitely a good tuning range on it to where you can make it kind of feel dead to where it doesn't follow the ground. And that's very much a rider preference thing, or you can make it feel very much alive. And there's definitely, I'd say, outside of that parameter where it's just not good, meaning it's way too active or it's way too dead of a feel. If you're in a certain range, then that's where it kind of comes down to rider preference. My job is to try to make sure the rider stays within the, I don't want to say acceptable range, but range that makes sense in terms of settings. Where Elsinore gets tricky is because on the main track, it's got really big freaking jumps.
Huge.
Like every jump is big. And I'm relating this to pretty much all the other local tracks here in California. There's maybe 1 or 2 jumps on the main track of that size. But at Elsinore's main track, almost every jump is big. LACR, I don't want to leave out that place.
Yeah, that's true.
LACR's got big jumps too on pretty much
Massive.
every part of the track as well. So that's what becomes hard, because if you go softer on your compression clickers to make the bike stick and track better when you're on the ground, you can give up a little bit of bottoming resistance. So Elsinore is a tricky one because you can adapt your bike to the conditions, so meaning how the dirt is, but those settings might be going in the opposite direction of the obstacles that are on the track. Not counting the terrain of the track as an obstacle, we're saying that's a separate one from it. So that's where kind of rider craft comes into play. I'd ask a rider, what do you value or favor more? Are you okay with riding a bike that maybe is a little soft and bottoms out, but sticks to the ground and handles well? Or would you prefer a bike that is a little more chattery, doesn't stick to the ground as much, but has more hold up for aggressive riding and hard landings?
Which makes a lot of sense. Now, kind of sticking with the different types of terrain, what would you suggest for like almost the opposite, which is sand? Because Elsinore is really hard pack, clay style dirt. But if you go ride a place at Cahuilla Creek in the morning, it's got a softer, like sandier, not full sand compared to like some other places throughout the US or even the world. But if you go out to like Nuevo and ride a sand track,
Yes.
it's almost polar opposite compared to Elsinore. So if we were to take that Elsinore setup, faster on the rebound and softer on the compression, and take that setup and go ride a sand track at Nuevo, it probably isn't best suited to tackle those conditions in the sand.
No, very good question, man. Shout out, I'm from Reno, Nevada, so shout out to the people in Fernley. They got an awesome sand track there. That's where I grew up. And just lots of sand. Lots and lots of sand. Really fun place to ride. So shout out to anybody up in that area that's ridden or raced that track. I know they recently brought it back as of maybe 6 months ago. So glad to see that.
Reno dirt looks pretty epic. I watched the Cam Zink Invitational. You mountain bike guys will know that name. And the dirt looks epic because they invite a lot of moto guys out there too and do like a style motocross, mountain bike kind of thing. And yeah, I just see the dirt and like the videos, the pictures. I'm like, dude, that place looks epic.
Definitely can be, man. A lot of decomposed granite, so kind of similar to Cahuilla Creek. So when you get water in there, or in their case, snow base, it can make for some really good dirt.
Nice.
For sand, that's quite a bit different, just because the terrain itself, meaning the dirt, or in this case sand, it has very high rolling resistance. What do I mean by that is, if you're on a pedal bike and you're riding on concrete, it's pretty easy to pedal the bicycle. If you take that same bike and then go ride through grass, it gets noticeably harder. And then if you take that same bike and go to sand or on the beach, it gets magnitudes harder to pedal. And that just shows you the impact that the terrain of the dirt can have on the ride. So as the dirt gets softer and deeper, that's going to resist the forward motion of the bike more. So we're going to have to not only gas it a lot harder to move a lot more, but as we gas it, it's going to want to compress the suspension because this is impeding our forward momentum. So again, the reason for clickers is because we want to maintain the same feel of your bike from track to track or from day to day. So for sand, I shouldn't go stiffer on compression because we want to resist that motion of it compressing and feeling it, and from feeling too overly soft. I'd probably leave rebound the same, at least to start with, meaning you went from your base setting that you were happy with and you're adjusting it for the sand track that day. I'll strictly just start with compression, and that's going to be firming it up. A good amount of clicks too, at least 4 clicks front to back, because there's a big difference going from a hard pack to sand. Again, just something you can try is ride your bicycle, go on the pavement and then go through soft dirt, and you'll notice how much harder it is to pedal.
Definitely. And also taking into account that engine braking or decompression braking, especially on some of these 450s, is a lot. So a lot of weight transfer is going towards those forks and that front end of the bike.
Yeah, when you brake too.
Exactly. And especially when you combine that with the sand, it's a lot of force being put on the front wheel, especially when you're off throttle or letting off the throttle heading into a turn. So it definitely makes sense to go stiffer on your compression, get that front end to stay up more in the travel.
Yes, right. I understand at first it can sound maybe counterintuitive to some, but it's understanding the environment of what's causing the bike to handle that way and why we are adjusting the bike in order to essentially just maintain a certain feel and the factors playing into it. We didn't cover if the sand track had big or small jumps, because in this case, it doesn't really matter. If there's big jumps on there, you're already going stiffer for the terrain. So that kind of goes hand in hand with itself. It's not one of those where you're going, oh man, I want to adjust the bike for the type of dirt, but the obstacles are calling for something else. So for the sand case, you pretty much go stiffer, and how stiff you need to go will depend on the depth of the sand, maybe how wet or dry it is, and then the size of the obstacles. So meaning jumps and rollers and bumps. Fernley has a lot of tabletops, a lot of rollers. The tables kind of get the lips worn out, so you're not jumping a lot. Kind of like Southwick. Practice, they're jumping jumps. First moto, the jumps are pretty rolled over and rounded. By second moto, it's pretty much a long whoop track. So it's also understanding, is a big jump going to be jumpable all day? Probably not. At some point, you could probably be half jumping it. So don't go too stiff to where it's not fun to ride. Or I meant like just no longer comfortable, but stiff enough to maintain the plush ride of the bike. And then like what are other popular tracks we could hit on for people? I guess Paula. A lot of people see Paula or Fox Raceway. So that's often pretty deep in the morning and pretty wet.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Especially towards the side of the track that's closest towards the starting gate. When you go out towards, they call it Mount Wallace, but like out towards the opposite end of the track.
Yeah, Brian.
It gets really hard pack. So it's almost like, I want to say dang near two different types of dirt, but like it's not the exact same, because you can tell they've thrown in like some sand or some softer dirt towards the start straight, and now towards the back it's more of that like natural Paula dirt that has been there for how many years.
Yeah. So I mean, that would be, so based on what I told you, what do you think would be a good setup going into, say you got there early, the track just opened up, and you have your bike at the base settings?
I would probably go, first thing in the morning, I would probably go out, do a moto at the standardized setting, and regroup from there.
That's your best answer there is, because the reason I say that is let the track tell you when to adjust the bike instead of preemptively adjusting it.
Right. What I wanted to say was just maybe a click or two stiffer.
Yes.
Just because Paula doesn't have not that many big jumps. Like if you ride the vet track at Fox Raceway and then go ride the main track at Fox Raceway, there's not a big discrepancy in the jump size for a majority of them. So I was just going to say maybe like a click or two stiff, just because you're going to be pushing the bike a little bit harder since there's not as many bumps on the track.
Yes.
So you can get away with going just a touch stiffer. But what I would do is I would start at the standardized setting, what you said, let the track tell you what the bike should be doing.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And as you ride at the same track over and over, you get to know what settings you like. So you may not be adjusting your bike as much. I think some of the content or information we're sharing in this video will be if you're traveling or you just got a new bike set up and riding at new tracks or new to you, in a sense. They are so close.
Yeah.
A few times I feel like he's going to hit Trey.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh man, the GoPro is just such a cool view.
Yep.
Yeah, so spot on with Fox. And then, so another good question people ask me is how to adjust your bike for second moto. And you alluded to this. You can certainly ride the track faster when it's firstly prepped and not many bumps. But sometimes people's fastest lap time or second fastest lap time come in first moto or even second moto, just out of pure adrenaline. They know the track and they're starting to push. So as the track evolves over time, it's important to pay attention. Has the track broken down and we're still maintaining the same speed and times as we were when the track was smooth? Or has it slowed down so much that our speeds, our lap times, and even we're not even jumping the same lines as we were earlier that day? Because if you're still holding the same speed and lap times as before, you probably want to keep your suspension settings the same, and you definitely don't want to go softer because you're hitting the same bumps with even more force now to make up for them, to get around the track at the same rate of time and at the same rate of speed. You may even find you need to go a click or two stiffer.
Right.
Not much, but at some point the track will break down to a point to where it's just physically not possible. You have to go slower because of how big or gnarly the obstacles have gotten. In that case, that's when you either default back to your plush or your base settings, or maybe even go to the softer settings that we'd have notated on our settings guide. Because Because at that point, the track is telling you, and your lap times are telling you, we've slowed down, we can't go as fast, and we're not even jumping maybe some of the combos or jumps as far as we could because of the conditions of the track. But it's looking at the track and knowing when to adjust, because different racers may have different motos. So if one racer's Moto 2, his second moto and Moto 2 is going to be very different than the racer that has Moto 15 in his second moto. So they're going to approach the day quite differently in terms of bike setup and how they're going to adjust it throughout the day as well.
100%. And this is maybe a loaded question because there's a lot of variables here, but you know, when you go ride, let's just bring up Kahia Creek, for instance. When you ride Kahia Creek on a Saturday and then you go back 2 weeks later on a Saturday again, and same track layout, same bike, same rider, but it feels different.
Yes.
Would you put that down to, well, it's the track conditions, we have to adapt the bike to those conditions, just because although it's the same dirt, same location, same track, the prep is slightly different, even though it may even be the same track operator. It's just the way the track forms and how it's ridden the previous days leading up to those Saturdays is different.
For a lot of riders, they often focus heavily too much on the suspension aspect. So, because I'll ask them, like, how's it feel in the jumps? Feels great. How's it feel in the bumps? Feels great. And their issue sometimes is more with the traction or the feel of the bike, which can be more of a tire selection. So it's important to understand what the bike is doing and what primarily influences that. And what I mean more specifically is the suspension heavily influences how the bike feels going over bumps and landing from jumps. How tight a bike steers through a corner is strongly going to be influenced by rider technique. That's going to have the biggest influence on it. And then chassis setup of the bike. And by chassis, I don't mean suspension clickers. I mean where the fork tubes are in the triple clamps, how high or low, what sag you have, so how that's going to adjust the ergonomics of the bike. Tires, of course, that's your contact point to the ground.
Yeah.
You know, so oftentimes people are making suspension adjustments when in reality, the more optimal adjustment is adjusting another part of the bike for it. So that's when it's important to understand the bike feels different today. Is it because of the suspension, or is it because of how the dirt is and maybe my tire's a little worn? I could adjust fork height or sag or maybe technique a little bit. So just understanding and knowing suspension is the absolute, or that's the optimal point to adjust based on feedback, and when to know when maybe that isn't the optimal point to adjust. You always can adjust it. That's what's tricky. There's a lot of overlap, meaning you could adjust the fork or shock one way to get it to have an influence on handling, but ideally you would want to adjust the fork and shock to influence how it feels on bumps, not necessarily handling. That's more influenced by, again, triple clamps, offset, fork tube height,
Chassis
sagment.
design.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, that's what's the trickiness, again, in setting up bikes, is how much crossover effect certain components can have on a bike. The more we can have each component do its specific individual job to its optimal performance and very little overlap elsewhere, is the best bike setup we're going to get. When we have things providing additional overlap we don't want it to, that's working against us. For instance, the chain's getting really tight on the KTM swing arms. That's creating resistance for the swing arm as it wants to move up. That's the primary job of the shock, is to create resistance against the swing arm as it moves up. It shouldn't be the chain. We always have that with every brand bike, but you can definitely adjust how much influence it does have. So that's one of the good example of overlap, of where you wouldn't want it and why you want very small amounts of it when it comes to tuning bikes.
Yeah, and sticking with the chain adjustment is one thing you told me the other week is when you adjust your chain, you want to check your sag, just because that rear wheel has more leverage.
Thanks for reminding me about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So a common reason why your sag changes on your bike, well, the most common reason is because you adjusted your chain. So if everybody's chain gets loose over time, so we want to adjust the chain slack and tighten it up. And as we do that, the rear wheel is going to move farther away from the shock. Now, the axle's only moved maybe a millimeter or two distance-wise from the shock, but we have the weight of the wheel, which is almost 40 pounds. So even though distance-wise to us it looks very small, relative to the shock absorber, that's a very big change. And after you've adjusted your chain 2 times, 3 at the most, your bike will sit a lot lower if you haven't adjusted the preload, because now the rear wheel has a lot more leverage over the shock. So ideally, every time you adjust your chain slack, you should recheck your sag, because likely you're going to just have to adjust it a little bit in order to maintain it. After a couple of chain adjustments, it's going to be quite a bit off. And then, as you could guess, what will happen when you put on a new chain and sprockets and everything goes forward?
You have to readjust your sag again.
Yes, exactly. You're going to have to go the other way for it.
Yep.
Other influences that can cause that, but I'd say they aren't the biggest influence, would just be the shock. Over time, it's going to not fade, but the oil inside it's not bled as good as it was anymore, just from operation. So a shock will definitely break in a little bit, but the chain adjustment is the biggest influence over why sag changes. Yeah, a friend of mine over the weekend texted me. His name's Tony Evans. He's a local pro up in Reno, Nevada, and he was racing at Fernley, or maybe just doing practice. And he said he was getting a little bit of head shake. So we just verified what his fork height was, his rider sag was, and we ended up just speeding up his rebound just a little bit. We kept compression the same, so we didn't want to go stiffer. That's not going to help. And we were hesitant to go softer just because of the speeds that they were going. He said the track was very fast that day. So we both decided, rebound, speeding that up a little bit would be the best adjustment. And we'll have to do another video on this, but rebound has a crossover effect on compression. Rebound is really a bypass adjuster. By bypass, I mean it's bypassing the valving. And the rebound adjustment, the valve that it's working with has a compression stack and a rebound stack on it of shims. So the more you back out that clicker and make it less restrictive, the softer to get on compression and the faster to get on rebound. Sometimes that works in your favor, sometimes it does not. Sometimes you want a faster rebound, but you don't want the fork to get stiffer, or you want a slower rebound, but you don't want it to get stiffer as well. That's not the case with compression on the fork or the shock. I mean, there's no overlap. You adjust that clicker stiffer or softer, it has zero influence on rebound. So only the rebound clicker on the forks and shock have that crossover or overlap effect when adjusting it. Sometimes it's in our favor, sometimes it's not.
For sure. And it's good to know. And if you guys have any of your struggles or any comments, questions for us that we did not cover in this video, please be sure to drop them in the comment section below. I think we hit like a lot of the nails on the head as far as deciphering what's a chassis change, what's a suspension change, what to do when you adjust your chain is a big one. Anything else before we close out?
Yeah, put in like a YouTube link of the video of where you're at. If you want some like custom feedback, throw in a link like, hey man, I ride here. It doesn't have to be you riding, but that helps us see where you're at. When we build our DIY kits or do any revalve for customers that aren't here in California, the one thing I ask everybody is I say, email me YouTube videos or where you ride. Again, it doesn't have to be you, but whether you're a trail rider, track rider, or desert rider, by you sending me videos, we at Ride JBI, sorry guys, allergies been kicking my butt. We at Ride JBI can get an exact visual on the terrain that you're riding and what you're encountering. And that gives us such a clear understanding of what you need, because we've built setups for people all over the world. We've ridden areas, all different types of terrains and environments. It's just making sure that we have a clear understanding of each other, meaning the tuner and the rider, and how you describe your conditions and how we think your conditions are. So video help really make sure we're on a very same page of what they're encountering and what we need to give them. But yeah, beyond that, I think that's kind of a good wrap up for today.
Sweet. Well, sounds good. That's going to wrap it up for this week's episode of Shop Talk. We will have many, many more to come. Again, we drop these weekly, so one per week. And I think we got some pre and post race stuff coming for the Pro Motocross series. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I hope it's going to be exciting, man.
Yeah.
Because it could just be
another 22-0.
which is still very cool. But
yeah,
you might as well just film second to last, because that's where all the racing is going to be.
For sure. For sure. Well, until next time, guys, we will catch you in next week's episode.